mean, officially I have 2 minutes left until coffee break, but I think you will have the patience to listen to me. But I have to start with some apologies. Firstly, it's a bit embarrassing, but I'm presenting something in an art museum without having prepared pictures. So sorry for that, I was too lazy to prepare it. My second apology is what I'm going to present, it is based mostly on literature. I still didn't have the time to go to the archive, not the least because I just have finished my postdoc study on 19th century Russia. So for that very reason, I have many great plans, but still I didn't have the time to make them real. Although I will present more or less something from the central perspective, the Soviet perspective, I would still like to start with a sort of personal anecdote, personal story, just to expand on Olaf's introduction to Western influences in the Estonian Soviet Republic. When I came for the first time to Estonia, to Tallinn in 1984, I mean, it was not the first time we went to the Soviet Union, which was due to the fact that I'm from Hamburg in West Germany, and Hamburg had this partnership with Leningrad, and so it was quite easy for us somehow to go to the east, to go into the country of the eternal evil, and much to the dismay, I think, of our parents, we were quite excited about that because our classmates, they went to London, Paris, but we went to a country where nobody of those people would ever go, at least that what we thought about. And as experienced travelers to the Soviet Union, we were 15, 16 years old. Of course, we were prepared. We were prepared to break through the Iron Curtain and bring something like nylon stockings, jeans, Der Spiegel, and things like that, and cassettes of Western music. But in Tallinn, the situation was, in our eyes, spoiled. It was spoiled because of it was like capitalism. Capitalism on the black market in the Soviet Union. Because when we wanted to change our German D-marks into rubles, the course was simply disastrous. We got so much more money for our D-mark in Leningrad compared to Tallinn. And that was, of course, thanks to our Finnish friends. They somehow spoiled our school children business in the Soviet Union. Okay, so much about my own experiences with we would call it today transnational experiences, but at least from the perspective of the Soviet power, of course, this was, something like criminal activities. Okay. In September 1959, the reality of Moscow's street life intruded into Soviet television, then still due to technical conditions, broadcasting mostly live. An estimated 600 to 700 people came to the studio and rushed to the scene wearing sheepskin coats, felt boots, and each of them carrying in his hands a samovar. Reportedly, some of these people were drunk and sweating, and someone even brought a live chicken. The organizers of this TV show, Вечер веселых вопросов, the evening of merry questions, had expected a few dozen people to follow the call of the host, I think he was a composer, Nikolai Bogoslovsky. The prize for participation in this contest was a brand new bicycle, and maybe that was already sort of explanation for this large number of contenders. But more importantly, in announcing this contest, Bogoslovsky had mentioned as conditions for participation only the sheepskin coat, the boots, and the samovar. He simply had forgotten to mention a key element in this contest. Every one of those contenders should bring a newspaper of December 31st, 1956, 3 years earlier. And of course, this condition presumably would have considerably lowered the number of contenders. After some time of hesitation in the studio, the transmission eventually was cut, and the viewers were left with a silent screen explaining the break with technical reasons. In result of this scandal, Вечер веселых вопросов was cancelled, and some people who were made responsible for it, among them even the director of the Central TV studio, were dismissed. Unfortunately, maybe that's the reason why I didn't prepare a PowerPoint. I didn't find any footage of this. I found the story in the really fascinating book by Christine Roret, and according to her, this new format, this new show, challenged the convention by inviting ordinary people to be on screen, ordinary people as themselves, and not as representatives of social categories like the leading worker or the prize-winning artist or the prize-winning athlete, something like that. According to her, Soviet television was no place for the working life. Soviet media space was sacred. As a consequence, the Central Committee condemned the show altogether for its vulgarity and its lack of ideological principle. Pošlost, bezidejnost, very prominent keywords in these years. According to the Central Committee, the Вечер веселых вопросов was meaningless entertainment, and that was a problem in itself. In result, and this is the important idea for Christine's story of how the Soviet Union built the media empire that lost the Civil War, this episode demonstrated not so much the impossibility of the real and ordinary on Soviet screen as the necessity for framing and packaging them. From now on, issues of real life obviously needed some sort of interpretation to be shown on Soviet TV. In my presentation, I will draw your attention to some of the consequences and contradictions of Soviet cultural policy in these years, in the so-called period of late socialism, against the broader background of the cultural civil war, and of course, against the background of the still existing traditions of the cultural codes of Stalinism. In this period, like in the West, time for leisure gradually increased for ordinary people, even in the Soviet Union. Obviously, however, the gap between ideological expectations and popular behavior grew as well, concerning at least the idea of cultured leisure. Soviet mass culture in the Stalinist shape gradually was losing its grounds, while simultaneously a culture of Soviet mass entertainment, meaningless entertainment, was evolving. One member of the studio of Вечер веселых вопросов that was responsible for the scandal in '59 remembered that during this program they got some telephone calls from viewers urging them not to cut the transmission. These viewers apparently appreciated that finally, indeed, life, to quote Stalin's famous saying, had become more joyful, even on Soviet TV screen. On the one hand, these viewers must have perfectly understood that the studio simply felt the need to cut this siege of the scene by real life. On the other hand, they, in fact, dared to call the officials, and they urged them explicitly to behave against the norms of what was used to be Soviet cultured behavior. In a way, these viewers who called the studio in September 1959, they were something like the avant-garde of changing patterns of media consumption in the USSR. Obviously, something was in flux in these years. Increasingly, time free of work or other social obligations did not necessarily bring freedom of state supervision. Nevertheless, whereas by the late 20s, the so-called propaganda state had gradually but drastically narrowed any form of competition for the Bolshevik point of view, after the war, what was considered as deviant behavior became ever more visible on the streets of the Soviet Union, like, for instance, in the case of the famous styliagi, this subculture of trendily dressed youth in urban centers who were basically obsessed with things like clothing, and of course, thus they were obsessed with consumption. And it's really remarkable that such a thing like this sort of youth culture could emerge immediately after the war. The story with this TV program, Вечер веселых вопросов, aptly illustrates that the party, of course, tried to keep the position of defining authoritatively what cultured leisure was about. First and foremost, in the Soviet understanding, radio, cinema, and TV were meant to mobilize and educate people. The aspect of entertainment was clearly understood as serving the goals of mobilizing and educating. Here we can draw a comparison with the emergence of Soviet commercial culture already in the 30s that had as much to do with the manipulation of desires as with their satisfaction, as has been argued by Katrina Kelly and Vadim Volkov. The policies of Kulturnost served the practical goal of shaping everyday behavior in accordance with uniform social cultured norms and met the ideological objective to integrate the values of the lower strata with those of the elite in the 30s. In a sense, this was the Soviet civilizing mission that aimed at an individual that would conform to normative patterns of behavior and would be committed to the values required by the state. This understanding of cultured leisure, to be sure, of a culture that really had something like work to do in order to educate the people, this understanding never really was challenged throughout the existence of the Soviet Union, although more and more Soviet media delivered, in fact, what the audience liked the most, pure entertainment. Consumerism, however, even in its cultured form, tended to undermine the purest idea of labor as self-sacrifice to the benefit of the Soviet project. Pretty much the same can be said about the increasing opportunities of leisure activities in the post-Stalinist period. They were not necessarily always compatible with what the party expected. In general, after Stalin's death, one of the most influential stories of the 1930s, as interpreted by Sheila Fitzpatrick, the call for sacrifice in exchange for the prospect of a radiant future, increasingly lost its appeal to Soviet citizens once their primary needs were met. There was simply hunger for something unusual. And indeed, for many Soviet citizens, the post-Stalin years brought a new life when they finally moved out of their overcrowded kommunalki into apartments of their own. At the same time, Soviet successes in the so-called space race, Laika, Sputnik, Gagarin, created the image of a modernizing country on its way to communism. Overtaking the United States seemed to be not at all utopian anymore. At least there was a true sense of the uncertainty about the real prospects of the world's first socialist society, at least for one single moment in history. Having left Stalinist terror behind, the new leadership under Khrushchev began to increase even the production of consumer goods in order to meet the needs of the people at least halfway. However, what should form a new source of legitimacy for the regime, for instance, the bold assertion in the party program of 1961 that communism is within reach, only seems to have created expectations the Kremlin eventually was never able to meet. At the same time, in abandoning Stalinist means of holding the society in fear, the regime gave up the ultimate sanctioning authority, despite the fact that the number of Gulag inmates again increased in the late 1950s. It is therefore a question of perspective to see the period under discussion either as culmination of Soviet culture or as the beginning of the end of the socialist experiment. Against this background, however, the scandalous episode with Vichy Vysyolovh-Vaprosov conveyed yet another story, a story of ambiguity and fear. It has been demonstrated by Miriam Dobson in her Khrushchev's Last Summer. The return of former Gulag inmates who fell under the amnesties of the mid-50s caused relief, at least in the segment of society we like to call liberally minded intelligentsia. But for a large share of the population, it proved to be not at all easy to leave behind the simple categories of good and evil that had shaped the Stalinist era. Dobson argues that Khrushchev's famous secret speech, that wasn't so secret at all, quote, robbed citizens of a heuristic device that had been used for making sense of the nation's confusing and turbulent life for over 2 decades, end quote. Take into account the large campaign the party organized in the late 50s against deviant behavior banned as hooliganism in these years, precisely in reaction to these ambiguous feelings concerning the returnees, and you have precisely what loomed large all of a sudden even from Soviet TV screen. Consider the inherent motive of this campaign, the vision of a true socialist socialist everyday life, and you understand what the scandal actually was about. Again, the comparison with the 1930s might be striking. If then most Soviet citizens, like has been claimed by Jochen Hellbeck, lacked an outside frame of reference apart from the regime's own doctrines, then the politics of cultural cooperation and opening to Western influences under Khrushchev, as well as the new sources of information, we already spoke about it, Western radio stations and so on, they provided just this precondition for the articulation of dissent, or at least of sort of un-Soviet alternatives in terms of lifestyle. Yet alternative offers didn't have to come necessarily from the outside. According to Dobson, the Gulag had produced its own subculture with a unique set of ideas and beliefs. No need to underline here that the Gulag, of course, was a product of the Soviet regime. Precisely this culture of prisons and camps was now, in a way, reintroduced into Soviet everyday life by these returnees with their songs and their symbols, their tattoos, and so on. And all of this, of course, had deep roots in Russian culture. Thus, the returnees brought back to the surface of Soviet everyday life pre-revolutionary traditions and values of the lower strata in a modified way. I mean, this is basically the explanation of the popularity of the so-called Bart culture with popular artists like Galic, Okudjava, and later Vysotsky. All this in September '59 must have somehow resonated in the eyes and ears of the members of the Central Committee that only half a year earlier had decided to introduce the famous druzhiny, these voluntary patrols, to control the streets and to identify troublemakers in the neighborhood. But despite all the incongruities under Khrushchev, there was never any sort of return to the Stalinist options of ensuring societal uniformity, rather the opposite, however unwittingly. In the Soviet context, Western cultural influences were enabled by the contradictions of the state's cultural policy. And this had to do, of course, with the larger background and the larger confrontation of the Cold War. The Soviet project, as such, was challenged by state policy itself, because the proclamation of the ultimate goal of overtaking America only invited to constant comparisons of the two systems' achievements. Susan has shown this fateful dynamic using, for instance, the example of the American National Exhibition and the famous kitchen debate between Khrushchev and Nixon on the occasion of this exhibition, another remarkable event of 1959, and I go not into details because maybe you will expand on it tomorrow. Technical innovation had always been crucial for the self-image of the country. However, Sputnik and Laika could make the people proud to be a Soviet citizen, but achievements in the space race did not automatically enhance everyday life. But for instance, as Olaf has shown us, shortwave receivers did. In fact, these shortwave receivers were produced now in ever-increasing numbers. But apart from transmitting Soviet broadcasts to remote areas of the country, they made it possible, as we have heard, to listen as well to Western stations. To jam enemy broadcastings were expensive and effective only locally. I mean, you simply had to go to your dacha, and there you could receive even Voice of America, things like that. It is striking that Moscow, on the one hand, never jammed English language radio, but promoted, on the other hand, learning foreign languages as an inseparable element of being a cultured Soviet citizen. I mean, everybody who has seen this famous film by Georgi Danilya, Я шагаю по Москве, will remember this scene when, in the neighborhood of the hero, somebody is learning, I think it was French, or even English, I don't remember exactly. But it was definitely a language of the capitalist enemy, and this was even shown in the cinema. And when Olaf did explain that the Soviets did not jam Russian broadcasts in non-Russian republics, they, on the other hand, of course, encouraged non-Russians to learn Russian. So in a way, state policy enabled these people to listen to foreign broadcasts. Another example would be tourism, because even tourism, although it was state-controlled more or less, it created as well the possibilities of niches, because the state capacities never were able to meet the needs of the Soviet tourists, and so there were simply some kind of business connections between people from Moscow, for instance, and local residents in Estonia or on the Crimea, so people could simply spend their holiday on the seaside, despite the problem that the state would never offer them any sort of travel. In fact, it was never forbidden to learn from the West and to make it a real Soviet experience. The results of cultural transfer, however, are never easy to predict. Thanks to the politics of cultural exchange under Khrushchev, both Soviet cinema and Soviet fashion, for instance, became integrated into this transnational world of film and style. We had already the examples of contacts in the art world. At international fashion exhibits in Moscow, Soviet designers would have a close look on Western models in order to reproduce them in their factories. But whereas the Soviet design world, and of course the Soviet consumer as well, became in this way acculturated to the seasonal rhythm of fashion, presentation, and change, Soviet planned economy was never able to do this. As for cinema, despite the Soviet film industry's impressive growth and increasing ticket sales on the own local market, its products were far from matching the international influence of Hollywood and Bollywood productions. And this may be the most vivid example of how the cultural civil war, in fact, was lost by the Soviet Union. But even worse, Soviet cinema culture massively westernized thanks to phenomena like stardom that threatened to undermine its mobilizing and educating mission. Soviet people started to collect pictures of actors, like, for instance, Nikolai Rybnikov, and not of construction workers, for instance. Although Rybnikov did play construction workers, officials realized very soon that the postcard sale did dissociate the actor from his role. What if people actually go to the movies because of the actor and not because of the role he plays or because of the story that is being told? To understand that people were attracted by a movie star despite the heroic and educative tale being told in the film must have been utterly disturbing for cultural functionaries. Nevertheless, already in the immediate post-war years, a certain capitalist understanding had taken hold in the Soviet film industry, and I do repeat what Olaf already told us. Marie Karak and Tarzan were the first real post-war movie stars in the Soviet Union, and these trophy films, they were something like a cash cow for the Soviet state. This was not because of lack of ideological vigilance or something like that. Far from that. Thus, in many ways, the changing patterns of cultured leisure in the 50s and 60s had much to do with the alternatives, the niches of alternative understandings of leisure time. And all these niches were being offered, if not really officially approved, but never really contested. People went to the cinemas to watch the Soviet movie Человек Amphibia in 1963, a fantastic story of love and crime featuring beautiful young stars and fascinating underwater photography, and basically nothing about ideology, something like that. They cared much less about predictable and typical Soviet stories usually brought to the screen. Therefore, cinema and later TV presented more and more material that could be contemplated outside of any sort of didactic function. In turning thus Soviet media into ventures of entertainment, the state was, of course, impressively successful, at least with the own audience. But the price was high if judged by the idea of Soviet culture's inherent civilizing mission. Much like in the West, viewers demonstrated a keen interest precisely in sweating drunken people on screen with a samovar in their hands. In that perspective, the huge success of Soviet mass culture and late socialism was a gigantic failure, because it was the exotic, the un-Soviet, that attracted the audience, and of course we might speak of a globalization of taste. That was also somehow trespassing the Iron Curtain. So even the Soviet Union could not escape the uncontrolled diversification of cultured leisure. Just take the most impressive and the most successful Soviet film, the film Pirati 20. Века, Pirates of the 20th Century, which was shot, I think, in 1980. And all the motifs repeated in this film were taken over from popular Western films. Fight scenes, exotic regions, and so on. In spite of a conclusion, I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that all this deviant behavior was not necessarily really anti-Soviet. It didn't have to be. Although Vasily Aksionov, the famous writer, has claimed, for instance, that the aforementioned Styliagi had been the first dissidents, my colleague Juliane Fürst proves convincingly that this was not necessarily the case with all of them. According to Juliane, they simply wanted to be different and marked a counterpoint precisely to the heroic ideal of the Frontoviki, the victorious soldiers of the Red Army. And of course, I mean, this obsession with fine clothing was not really in opposition to the idea of a Soviet cultural citizen. A cultured Soviet citizen had to be dressed perfectly. According to Alexei Yurchak, late socialism became, quote, marked by an explosion of various styles of living that were simultaneously inside and outside the system, end quote. The adaptation process of these various lifestyles to Soviet realities was quite controversially discussed, for instance, in the Latvian film, Lehko li būt maladim, Is It Easy to Be Young, still in 1986. And we may argue that all this process led to the phenomenon of especially younger urban people who lived somewhere at the margins of socialism. Or we may say that they were simply eager to create or to realize an own vision of what socialism could offer. Thus, what Jurča calls the imaginary West, the knowledge and aesthetics associated with this particular Soviet idea of the West, had become an indivisible and constituent element of late Soviet culture. Western taste, at least in the understanding of a Soviet citizen, Western taste in terms of leisure culture became a normal element of Soviet society. My favorite example of this is the very prominence of those Western plastic bags in the late Soviet Union. Everybody carried these plastic bags, sometimes even with nude pictures on this plastic bag, something that was completely out of fashion in the West already. But for the Soviet Union, this had a particular meaning of being cultured. Jurča proves this argument very impressively, I think, with Komsomol officials who, without being cynical, could condemn capitalist influences during official meetings and play King Crimson, Uriah Heep, and Led Zeppelin without hesitation later in the evening at Komsomol parties. Both was possible. Even if we might say that rock was maybe too exciting to be really Soviet, in their understanding, this kind of music, be it Western or later even Soviet in origin, was of course an integral part of their concept of a socialist future. And thus, even Western art rock became part of cultured leisure for Komsomol activists. On a very basic level, all this, in a way, sounds very familiar in the ears of a particular generation in the West as well. We had this point already in the discussion. Therefore, I would agree with Jeremy Suri, who claims that both systems experienced this sort of generational conflict between the conservative old culture of suites and big band dances and the new culture of jeans and rock and roll, and which also, of course, undermines the classical narrative of the Cold War. Also in the West, the mass audience more and more preferred spectacular shows to educational programs. And it is true that subcultures on both sides of the Iron Curtain challenged basic assumptions about the so-called good life represented by the older wise men, to quote Suri's terms. Still, the Soviet experience was unique, if only for the fundamental conviction that it simply wasn't conceivable in the terms of the party's authoritative discourse to be analyzed on the same terms as the capitalist world. Thank you for your attention.
Written, therefore, it may be only a question of perspective, whether one sees the period under discussion at the culmination of the Soviet culture or the beginning of the end of a socialist experiment. And now, after you conducted research, what can you say about this? What do you personally think?
Yeah, thank you for bringing this topic up again. I really think it depends on perspective. There will be no final answer, because the vision of real communism, real socialism in the mid-50s, you cannot compare to the visions these young Komsomol activists had in the late 70s, early 80s. So, I mean, in a way, the whole framework for this question was constantly moving and constantly, changing. So I have no clear answer to this yet. And I don't know actually where I could find an answer to this question in the sources. I mean, this is what is history about. You can ask some cool questions, but they are open to discussion.
Yes, it depends on just the prevailing data, whether you have more information on this statement or on that.
Just a comment on, well, we all know that Stalin's death marked a big break in Soviet politics and so on. After this, life improved, etc., etc. On the other hand, I think one should not overestimate the break. So you made the argument that, or you took the argument from literature, that mass entertainment came after the old man was dead, more or less. But as you know as well, if you look at films or music, you have Stalinist mass entertainment, and some of the films are well-made comedies, etc. So, and when I looked into Soviet radio programming, it was already during Stalinism this discussion, how much music, what kind of music, and so on, and functionaries were very aware of the importance of popular music. They would call it another name, but even jazz music was ordered from composers and so on to have good Soviet popular music. So you have the idea of mass entertainment before. I wouldn't cut. And the other point is, of course, the standard of living increased substantially during the Khrushchev period, but the Soviet Union by the end of the 1950s, in the early 1960s, was still a rather poor place, even when people moved into the Khushchevka. And I can confirm this with data for an article I collected and haven't finished yet, that still in the late 1950s, people died of diseases caused by malnutrition and so on. So there are still enough places in the Soviet Union where people didn't get enough calories, things like that. So for those people, there was not the idea of cultured leisure or not. There was simply the basic idea to survive in a proper way.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I mean, actually, maybe I didn't make it that clear, but my presentation, not the least, was simply directed in order to, was composed in order to question this sort of break after Stalin's death. I mean, there are so many elements of this popular culture in the 60s, in the 70s, even today, that go back to the 30s. All these popular films, Dunayevsky's music, I mean, this is the evergreen the Soviet Union actually produced. Maybe this was really the one thing that was more or less, not 100% original Soviet, but the composition of all these foreign elements into one single cultural idea was very successful. Maybe more successful than anything that came later. Living standards, yes, of course, yeah, sure. I mean, we base mostly our presentations on data from the centers. And very rarely you find really information about what was going on in, I don't know, even in urban centers in Siberia. So, but this is a classical problem for studies of Socialism in Studies of Soviet Union.